Now let's take a look at the impact that aperture has on depth of field or depth of view of the image. In this series of photos, I focused on the bloom of the flower, and depending on the different aperture that's used, a certain distance behind or in front of that flower will also appear to be in focus. It gets somewhat confusing when we think about the correlation between aperture and lens opening, but hopefully it'll be easy to understand the correlation between that f-stop number and depth of field. When we're talking about aperture, we're talking about the size of the lens opening, and remember that the f-stop, or the ratio, the number value, is inversely proportional to the size of the opening. So in this case, we're at f22. It's a large number, high f-stop number, but it corresponds to a very small opening in the lens. At the other end of the scale, at f2.8, the lens opening is very large, even though the f-stop number is small, and it just has to do with the ratio. And it's one of those photographer things that we need to just memorize and figure out. But maybe a trick for remembering the correlation between aperture and depth of field would be this. At f2.8, for example, in this picture, my focal point is the flower. And if you think about standing in 2.8 feet of water, very shallow water, very shallow depth of field. And as you can see in this picture, the flower is in focus, but the rock in the background, which is only about a foot away, is not in focus. When we jump to the other end, f22, so our swimming pool example, standing in 22 feet of water, there is a larger depth of field from the flower, and to the point where the rock is actually in focus. This is a good thing to remember, especially when taking portrait photos where you're using some kind of a background. If you're placing somebody right up next to the background and you're shooting at a high f-stop number, f11 or higher, you're going to have a lot of depth of field to the point where tree branches or bricks or lines in the background are going to be visible, and that's where you get the sticks coming out of people's heads look. If you switch to a larger aperture, smaller aperture number but larger lens opening, you can see that the depth of field shrinks so much that the background image looks blurred. And this is a good creative tool to use for taking especially portrait photos or photos where you have a cluttery background.